Simply recording. Great. So basically, this is the study group of LexDAO. My name is Paolo Gangi. I'm a lawyer from Italy, crypto lawyer, and a member of LexDAO. I also, full disclosure, I also created a company in Marshall Island with Adam. So just to say at the beginning of this. So this study group will be about Marshall Island. Marshall Island is a tiny country in the Pacific, which used to be an offshore jurisdiction for shipping, and now after has become very popular in the crypto space for because it has introduced a very friendly crypto legislation. So I will introduce the various panelists. Adam Miller, who is the CEO and founder of MIDAO. MIDAO is a company which is basically dedicated to providing corporate services, basically for everyone who wants to create a company in the Marshall Island can ask Adam or MIDAO. Then we have Tatyana Cerullo, who is the managing member of Marshall Island Lawyers LLC. So she's basically a Marshall Island crypto lawyers. Then we have Laura Cole, who is an attorney and director of business development at Industrial Business Lawyers. She's a US crypto lawyer, and she also has a lot of experience in creating companies for in Marshall Island for crypto clients. And then we have Pablo Moncada, who is not a lawyer, but is basically a client of Adam. He's the founder of MoonDAO. It's a very famous DAO in the crypto space. So he created MoonDAO is incorporated in the Marshall Island. So this is the panelist. I will ask with Adam, can you explain to us what MIDAO does and why Marshall Island might be a good option for incorporating crypto projects? And maybe you can also give us some information about the Marshall Island tax regime. Thanks.
Sure, sounds good. And I plan to speak for about 15 minutes. I'll probably breeze through some of the slides, and we can always revisit some later if it's helpful to anyone. So I'll skip the disclaimer. You can go back and read it if you want. And to just go right to just very briefly, I want to share that I'm a technology entrepreneur by background, not a lawyer. Unlike some of the other folks on the stage, I started out writing code in QBasic on MS-DOS, and I'll skip the rest of what's on this slide, except to say that about 3 years ago, I decided to leave my job doing tech innovation at Capital Group, a big finance company, to get into DAOs full time. And this is where the story of MIDAO really begins. So I was building technology for a DAO that was offered $1 million grant from the Moonbeam Ecosystem Fund. And Moonbeam said, to accept this grant, you need a legal entity for your DAO so that you can sign the grant agreement. And so this was the first we had come across this legal entity issue. And we looked around the world. We looked at Delaware, Switzerland, Cayman Islands, some other popular crypto jurisdictions, and came to the realization that all these legal entities all over the world had at least these two key deficits from our perspective in terms of what we were looking for. One is that they all required us to have some kind of management team, a board, directors, trustees, managers, something. And we felt like as a DAO, we didn't necessarily want to have a management team or board of any kind. And two was that all these legal entities would require us to know the names and physical addresses of all of our members. And we wanted to be able to have anonymous members as a DAO, if not at that time, then certainly in the future. And so we had the idea to reach out to a senator in the Marshall Islands. We knew that the Marshall Islands was already a leading jurisdiction in the shipping industry. So for anyone who doesn't know, there are something like 40 New York Stock Exchange traded companies that are Marshall Islands corporations. And tens of thousands of other companies registered there, all in the shipping industry. So we actually reached out to the senator and said, hey, in some ways, DAOs are kind of like ships. They don't live in any one place. They're kind of everywhere and nowhere at the same time. How would you like to expand your country's expertise from shipping into Web3? And so this began a journey over the past 3 years where we've written, most recently with the help of an input from lawyers all over the world, and actually partnered specifically with Tatyana on drafting the recent legislation. I was one of the speakers today. And so we've written and passed 3 laws in the Marshall Islands that have created and enhanced a nonprofit and for-profit DAO LLC, originally based off of what was done in Wyoming, but much enhanced since then. And we created the company called MIDAO, which stands for Marshall Islands DAO, to be the registered agent that can create and maintain these entities for people from again, not from a lawyer's perspective. And that's where lawyers like LC and Tatyana come into play. You'll hear from them soon. We're just a registered agent. So we do help with template documents. We help people through the process in general. Since we started MIDAO, after we passed the first law a few years ago, we've signed up over 150 DAOs that are now already created or in the process of creating their DAO LLC in the Marshall Islands. So that's how we got started. I want to just take one step back, though, and just briefly say, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but from our perspective, from a kind of legal-ish perspective, right, what is a DAO? What is different about it from a traditional organization that means it needs its own laws and regulations? And really, to me, what the DAO is an organization that's doing one or more of these 4 things on the blockchain: membership tracking, usually through tokens, governance and voting, treasury management, and sometimes controlling software. And just to go into a little more detail, right, when you compare traditional organization to DAO, and again, thinking about why do we need new laws and new legal approaches to DAOs versus traditional organizations, it's because instead of tracking members on paper or documents or stock certificates or through a transfer agent, you're tracking your members usually with tokens or some kind of smart contract. Instead of doing your voting and your governance in a board meeting or using a shareholder proxy voting company, spending millions of dollars to do an annual shareholder vote for a public company, or maybe less if you're just having a meeting and raising your hand and saying yay or nay, still, this is different, right? You're using smart contracts to count the votes. And then, of course, controlling money and software differently from a traditional organization too, in that you may not have a bank account, or even if you do, you're also controlling money directly on the blockchain, and you may also be governing a protocol. And I'll get a little bit into some of the structures we see commonly when protocols are involved a little bit later as well. So again, just briefly before I get into the legal issues, I just want to share why this is so important and so exciting, to me. And the reasons for that are that when you do everything transparently and with guaranteed compliance on the blockchain by doing these things on chain, it's as easy to start an organization as it is to launch a website, and as easy to scale an organization as it is to scale a website in the cloud. And that was never the case before. And I always love to talk about this example. Actually, one of the founders of Constitution DAO I saw join the call. So good to see you here, Graham. But Constitution DAO is one of the early DAO success stories. They started an organization, a structured organization, raised almost $50 million, and placed a bid in an auction at Sotheby's to try to buy a physical copy of the US Constitution in under a week. Right? Started organization, scaled it to tens of thousands of members, raised $50 million, took a corporate action. There just is no way to do that in the traditional corporate world, right? It's virtually impossible and extremely expensive. And I think it's a great example of how DAOs are able to do things much faster while being more transparent and more compliant than traditional organizations. So, in the talks that I give, sometimes I talk about lots of legal issues for DAOs, and you can see a long list of them here on this slide. But I'm going to focus today on the concept of just briefly DAOs without legal entities and why legal entities are important. And especially, I'm going to dig into jurisdiction and legal entity selection from the perspective of myself having, again, written the laws in the Marshall Islands and helped hundreds of DAOs now work on creating legal entities in the Marshall Islands. So again, just very briefly, by way of some background, why do DAOs need legal entities in the first place? Well, I mentioned the second bullet point earlier. The whole reason I came across this opportunity to work in the Marshall Islands was because someone told us, we're not giving you $1 million until you sign this contract. So, generally speaking, right, organizations cannot sign contracts if they don't have a legal entity. And you have that highly jurisdiction dependent treatment. Usually we're talking about a general partnership. right? If a group of people engages in a common enterprise, then most jurisdictions, and we've seen this come to pass with the court cases so far in the United States targeting DAOs, where the judge says in the findings, very matter-of-factly, because this organization did not have a registered legal entity, we're going to treat them as a general partnership, which means there's unlimited personal liability for all the participants, right? And so we can come after all the individuals who are members of the DAO and hold them liable for what we're saying the DAO did wrong. And so not only is there that personal legal liability, but there's the pass-through tax liability, right? Where a general partnership, again, just a group of people engaging in a common enterprise, generally you're going to be taxed as individuals on the DAO, on the organization's earnings. And so if that DAO makes $1 million and there are 10 equal members and there's no legal entity, then you are definitely almost certainly going to have $100,000 income tax liability on each of those 10 members, right? And so all of these are reasons why most people in the Web3 world have realized you need legal entities for your DAOs and for your crypto projects in general. It's not really, and now there are exceptions, right? If you're trying to do something that's subversive, revolutionary, just you're trying to experiment with how can we do things that are outside the legal system as much as possible. We're going to be anonymous. We're going to hide. Fine. I have no problem with that. It's very interesting too. But I think most crypto projects are just saying, we want to be part of the business world. We want to follow the right laws and regulations, follow the right tax rules, and then do what it is that we're excited about doing. So let's get into jurisdiction and legal entity selection. There are lots of options. Let me just first start by acknowledging that. And it's never easy to choose. I've seen people try to create flowcharts. I think there's a couple kind of well-known ones in the space. One was by Paradigm. There was something like a flowchart in the paper by David Kerr and Miles Jennings. These flowcharts always fall short. They make so many assumptions, and there is just no way to go through a series of yes or no questions and arrive at this is the perfect legal entity for you. There's just so many nuances to it, not only in terms of your corporate organizational structure, but the business that you're in, right? Some DAOs are building DeFi. Some DAOs are centralized exchanges or banks. Some DAOs are doing gaming. Some DAOs are hosting events, right? And all these things are very different and have implications for, choosing a jurisdiction, especially, but even maybe choosing an entity type. Not to mention where are the founders? Where are the contributors? Where is the product going to be built? And just as there are a practically unlimited number of legal entity types, you have practically unlimited number of jurisdictions. Something like 220 countries in the world. Not all of them are really generally considered for global corporate entity formation, but many of them are. And so you have the ones that were popular in crypto even before DAOs were really a thing. Cayman Islands, BVI, Switzerland, the Cayman sandwich was a common option that I'll talk a little more about. And then more recently, you have DAO-specific laws. Now, to my knowledge, and by the way, anything that people see in this presentation that you might take issue with or have a different perspective, please send me a chat or raise your hand or send me a note later. To my knowledge, the only places in the world that have passed DAO-specific laws are Wyoming and other U.S. states, and the Marshall Islands, which is our MIDAO legislation. And would love to see more countries do that. And a lot of countries have talked about doing it, but we haven't seen it yet. Also popular in the United States, the UNA, which I meant to add a D because now there's the DUNA in Wyoming that we heard about last month from Miles Jennings. Really exciting. I'll talk more about that in a minute too. And then the Colorado Cooperative, which can be a really good fit for some DAOs as well. So just a couple examples of how we see our clients structuring their ecosystem. And then I have this comparison matrix of legal entity jurisdictions and types, which is where I want to spend the majority of the time, or at least a chunk of the time here. The point I want to make here is we often see people doing something that I think is very unique to crypto, which is you have an element of your legal structure that is not incorporated, and that's the protocol. Right, it's on the lower right of the chart here. So on the chart, we have in the lower left is the members, or usually the token holders. Maybe some of them are also users. At the top is your, let's say it's a MIDAO nonprofit DAO LLC. It could also be a Cayman Foundation, could be whatever. And then in the bottom right, you have the protocol. Maybe that's a DEX. that the DAO it builds and supports and markets and launches onto the blockchain. But then the company is not saying that protocol is part of the company. They're not accounting for every dollar that goes in and out of the DEX as if it were going in and out of the company. There's absolutely not doing that in any case I've ever heard of. What they're doing is they're saying there's really kind of three components here. There's the entity, there's the unincorporated protocol, and then there's also the members. And actually, very commonly we see it even a little more complicated because they add at least one other entity into the mix, and you have the DAO here at the top. You have still the protocol at the bottom, the members on the left, but then maybe you also have a devco, opco, labco, or some of the common things people call, and often that's going to be a local for-profit and traditional entity local to where the founders are or the core development team or something like that. And so that could be a Delaware LLC or a Delaware corporation. I mentioned earlier the Cayman sandwich. What was really common, and I still see some people doing today, is you have a Cayman foundation sandwiched between a Delaware C Corp or LLC and a BVI foundation. And each of those plays its own role. So I want to spend a few minutes on this slide. This slide is much further developed from the last time I showed it, and so there's especially the possibility that there are errors, and there could always be matters of debate and judgment. And in particular, you'll see I actually even have a couple question marks because I genuinely just do not know the answer to the question where those question marks are. But let me just walk through this for a second. What I've tried to do is list on the left side of the screen some of the common issues that people think about and that lawyers think about when they're helping a client choose their legal entity and jurisdiction, right? So it doesn't matter to you that there's a DAO-specific law, right? We heard from Miles Jennings last month that one of the key reasons for creating the DUNA was just because people would look at the UNA and say, well, the thing is, I don't know if that's made for DAOs. And so now there's the DUNA, which is almost exactly the same as the UNA, maybe some small changes. And now by having the D in the name, maybe people are more likely to consider it. And I think that's, even if it's very kind of subjective, I think it's fair. The second point, reducing U.S. Legal nexus. So now sometimes you're trying to do the flip side, right? Sometimes if someone says, well, we definitely want an entity in the U.S. So, okay, well, then you'd flip the X's and the check marks here. But often that's one of the biggest questions for a crypto project is, are we looking for an entity in the U.S. or outside the U.S.? Offshore, they'll often say. It's a little bit of a misnomer because it depends what shore you're on, what's going to be offshore. But, and again, maybe you want an onshore and offshore entity and more. I think the third point is one I really want to highlight because, again, that was one of the reasons we created this entity in the first place, is this concept of, do you want to have a DAO with no trustees, directors, managers, board of any kind? That's what we wanted when we set out to create our DAO 3 years ago, that caused us to reach out to the Marshall Islands in the first place. And I think especially sometimes when you think about securities laws in the United States, one of the really common things people try to do is avoid the appearance or reality of there being a central management-like team. Often it's the founders that are trying to avoid looking this way. They don't want to look like there's a central group of people that others are relying on for the success of their token, investment, project, whatever. And so I think there can be a lot of benefit to saying, you know what, we're going to create a legal entity with no managers. Of course, some people who come from the traditional world say, that's crazy, how can you do that? And that's part of what we're trying to solve in the DAO world, is how to effectively have an organization and run an organization without managers. Not to mention from the government perspective or law enforcement perspective, how do we hold organizations accountable when there's no managers? These are great questions, but the fact is there is demand for organizations with no managers. And I think that we may be the only legal entity in the world that has no managers, no directors, no nominee versions of those, et cetera. Another key point is this, what I used to just say the nonprofit option, but it was interesting to hear that even the DUNA and many other nonprofits actually do pay taxes as if they were for-profits. And so I don't fully understand all the nuances of, for example, why you'd want to be a nonprofit and if you're still paying taxes or what that really means. But certainly something that people are often looking for in crypto is a tax-free nonprofit legal entity that was popularized with the Swiss Foundation, the Cayman BVI Panama Foundations, et cetera, and that we've also achieved with the nonprofit Marshall Islands DAO LLC, which is there's simply no taxes. And that was one of your questions also, Paolo, was to address the tax question. You do have these two options with the DAO LLC in the Marshall Islands. There's the nonprofit, which is totally tax-free, and no pass-through taxes, right? Just like a Cayman Foundation. And then you have the for-profit option, which has both a 3% gross revenue tax. So it's more of an old-fashioned style tax. It can be better for some scenarios where maybe your income is mostly not derived from revenue, such as from investment income, then you're not going to be paying that tax on that income. Or maybe even it's okay with you to have a 3% revenue tax. And then there's also a pass-through tax on the members, like there would be with a LLC in the United States. And so you have that option. This question of wrapping the entire DAO is an interesting one. You know, with the foundation model, what I usually see people doing is you actually have a board that's in charge of the company, right? And it can be just one independent director, or it can be an independent nominee along with several others. That board are the only members of the company. And then you write some language into your operating document saying, we're going to watch how this group of token holders votes and act in accordance with their wishes, as long as what their wishes are not illegal, et cetera. And so in that case, I would say you're not really wrapping all those members, right? You're just wrapping, technically, you're just wrapping that board. Now with the Duna, I think it's a little more complicated. And I don't know if this should be a check or not, because it's kind of a unique structure. And again, I have to probably look into that more. Anonymous membership. So I think that is something the Duna you could argue, can provide, in the sense that, no, so I guess the difference is with the Duna, again, it's just a board, right? You're not saying everyone is a member of the Duna, I don't think. I could be off on that point. Again, it's very new, hasn't even been used yet, as it hasn't gone into law yet. But this concept of, do you want to be able to have anonymous members? And, you know, with a US legal entity, an LLC, for example, you have to know the names and addresses of all the members. You can't have anonymous members. I think with the foundation model, again, I may actually change these check marks, because really you have very few members, right? The board is not anonymous, and everyone else is not even a member in the first place. A few more items I added to the slide more recently is, one is the concept of not requiring a local law firm or nominee. And so that's something that I believe the Swiss, Cayman, BVI, and Panama all require you to hire a local law firm and a local nominee director. And so that can just make things more expensive and more complex, whereas that's not a requirement for any of the DAO LLCs, including in the Marshall Islands. This clear and favorable token and securities treatment. Again, that's one of the reasons, another reason why we created the Marshall Islands DAO LLC was we just saw all this confusion around, is my token a security or not? And so while I have some question marks on other jurisdictions, you know, one thing that's really clear is that in the Marshall Islands, if you have a nonprofit DAO LLC, the governance token of that nonprofit, the law says exactly this is not a security, right? And there's other cases where it says that. And so that might help you if, for example, you're applying to have your token listed on a centralized exchange, and that exchange says we need an opinion from a lawyer that says whether or not your token is a security according to your local jurisdiction. And I put a check under Cayman BVI because I know that's commonly one of the reasons people do Cayman BVI is because Cayman is good for some reasons, but not good for the token, but they like BVI's token treatment. And so you kind of combine the two. So the token is launched by BVI. So I don't know enough about all the details of the security laws, but it seems like that's a compelling option for people. And finally, this concept of blacklists. So I think, you know, there's this United Nations terrorist watch lists and blacklists, and sometimes people want to avoid those. Different from a gray list. There are these lists of uncooperative tax jurisdictions from the EU, for example, that the Marshall Islands and Cayman and others are on and off of. And sometimes people have told me, well, actually, I'd rather that you're not cooperative with the EU on taxes. And so maybe that's not such a bad thing. But also some people have said, well, we'd really rather work with someone who's not on any of those lists, which I can understand as well. So just a few links here. It looks like I took up the full 20 minutes. So I'll hand it back to you, Paolo, and just let me know if you want me to dig into anything else in more detail.
Yeah, I think thank you for this great presentation. I think we can pass to the other panelists, and maybe there will be some questions at the end. So thank you very much, Adam. So I will pass now to Tatyana Cerullo. She's a Marshall Island lawyer, crypto lawyer. So I would ask Tatyana if you could give us an overall overview of the new legal framework that recently, in the last 2 years, more or less, I know the Marshall Islands introduced, which is crypto-friendly, but not only crypto-friendly, but also specifically tailored to decentralized organization. Adam, for example, mentioned that you can have an entity, a legal entity without a director, which of course is very important for the decentralized ethos. So please give us an overview. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Just a little quick background about who I am. So I am a US-based attorney, and I am US trained as well. I have law licenses in Hawaii, New York, and, excuse me, sorry, lost my screen, and the Marshall Islands. And I've been traveling to the Marshall Islands and practicing Marshall Islands law since 2006, so about 18 years. Adam and you, Paolo, had mentioned the other registry that has made Marshall Islands known around the world. It has a robust corporate and maritime registry, and prior to working with MIDAO and MIDAO clients, I was supporting, well, and still support the traditional corporate maritime registry, and have done a lot of litigation and corporate work around those entities, and banks and law firms representing clients doing business with those entities. So basically, the Marshall Islands, although it's very small by population, and it's out there in the middle of the Western Pacific, what's remarkable about having worked there for so long is that it really is a strong, stable government and legal system, and bright, very innovative and progressive politicians. And as Adam explained, were quick to accept this idea and expand their offshore registry for traditional companies to expand into Web3. And it's not surprising. Overall, the legal system looks a lot like the United States legal system. After World War II, the Marshall Islands was a United States trust territory. And then in 1986, with a treaty between the US and the Marshall Islands called the Compact of Free Association, it became a sovereign nation and adopted a constitution that looks inspired by the US Constitution. So this is the DAO laws are couched in this very modern and US inspired legal system. There were already corporate laws in place in the early 1990s to support the other registry for the other corporate and maritime registry. And the first time that we've seen DAOs enter the arena in the Marshall Islands is with the Nonprofit Entities Act, and basically it allowed for nonprofits to register, nonprofit DAOs to register in the Marshall Islands. That quickly evolved, and the next year the DAO Act was passed to have a specific law tailored to DAOs. And then most recently, at the end of 2023, the amendment to the DAO Act was passed, and that's what Adam was talking about. I assisted with drafting that law. So Adam covered a few points that are that the amendment covers. Just overall, it clarified a lot of definitions and requirements and procedures, forms, etc. But to get to the specifics, I guess I'll just dive into it. It also sort of clarifies how other laws apply to DAO. Other Marshall Islands laws apply to DAOs under the ones that are registered under the DAO Act. And as part of the framework, we have the Limited Liability Company Act. And this act is modeled after Delaware law. So as you all probably know, a lot of corporations are registered in Delaware, and it has a robust body of laws for courts to interpret what all of these statutes mean. And the Marshall Islands courts, for example, would look to Delaware to interpret the LLC Act, which would also apply to DAOs. But of course, as we were saying, and Adam pointed out in his presentation, that DAOs need specific laws to meet their unique characteristics. And of course, a traditional LLC has requirements that you would just throw your hands up when thinking about applying the same thing for DAOs. For example, with the LLC Act, in the amendment, in the DAO Act amendment, it provides that, look, you don't have to have the same record keeping requirements in paper and kept in, a central location. All of your record keeping requirements can be kept on a public blockchain as long as everything is recorded and available. There's no other requirement to keep records. Everything is already there. As far as Adam touched on securities laws, the RMI Securities Act itself, it only applies to DAOs in particular. If they're transferring, issuing, selling digital securities to Marshall Islands residents. So the whole law just doesn't even apply to DAOs unless they're being sold to RMI residents, and it's unlikely. Most DAOs are global and operating elsewhere. Also, as Adam also mentioned, all digital assets, including NFTs issued by nonprofit DAOs to its members or in advancing its nonprofit purpose are not deemed a digital security. So that's just very clear. That was one of the points, was that we want certain points to be very clear and not ambiguous as it may be in other jurisdictions. Also, a governance token, just straight up, that's conferring no economic right, is also not a security. Let's see, another point that was added and clarified was that in the DAO Act, you can have series LLCs as well. This is modeled after the Delaware LLC Act as well, and we clarified that there's no additional reporting requirements on an LLC for each of those series. Let's see what else. Adam had talked about the tax law, so I'll skip that. DAOs, and Adam also mentioned this as well, but it's clearly written in the amendment that DAO LLCs are permitted to create open source software, which is then used by other people on the blockchain independent of the DAO's involvement. So DAOs are separate from the protocol. That's an important point. DAOs are allowed to use blockchain and cryptocurrencies in their operations, and it doesn't mean that they're necessarily considered a VASP, virtual asset service providers. So I'll just also throw out my highlights that for choosing a Marshall Islands DAO, they're specially recognized in the Marshall Islands and customized to the unique characteristics of DAOs. The laws are supportive. There's a whole registry devoted just for DAOs, which you don't see in other jurisdictions. It avoids the US jurisdiction if that's desired. What I love about the Marshall Islands model or laws is that it really can have you can have the dream of having a decentralized organization, really, without having to specify directors, trustees, officers, managers, etc. And people who have to step up and be afraid to have extra liability or responsibility, and that a lot of DAOs don't. They don't want that. Right, and then there's no requirement to have anyone on the ground in the Marshall Islands being your local agent or local law firm, representative, supervisor, etc. None of that's required, so it's more cost efficient. You've got the nonprofit, for-profit option. RMI again has a great reputation worldwide because of its long-time corporate and maritime registry. Banks, well, not that all DAOs would be interested in banks, but at least the small island nation is recognized by a lot of institutions around the world because of the other registry. And then I mentioned the record keeping. You're allowed to keep it on the blockchain, and most members can remain anonymous, which is another plus for a lot of DAOs. And governance by smart contract is specifically allowed by law. So it's a question if those points sound good.
Okay, thank you very much, Tatyana. So I will pass now to Laura. Laura is a US lawyer, a US crypto lawyer. She has also been very active in creating with Adam companies in the Marshall Islands for I think US, but also international clients. So maybe she can give us, she can speak to us about your experience in what you found interesting, what your clients found interesting, some stories, some specific of the Marshall Island legislation. I would say from an international point of view of international clients, US, but not only US clients, establishing a crypto projects in the Marshall Islands. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paolo, for having me. So I'm Laura, LC, as most people in the industry know me. I work at Industrial Business Lawyers, formerly International Blockchain Legal. We're a boutique blockchain firm that's been established since about 2017, 2018. So we've seen a lot of companies form in the space, a lot of the change over time, a lot of emphasis on decentralization or utility along the way. We help a lot of companies navigate their corporate architecture onshore, offshore, depending on their needs. And we do a lot of the non-security token status advisory. So what we initially saw was a big push, especially in the DAO. There's like a resurgence of, I want to be a DAO, I need to form a DAO. When Wyoming came out, that was a very hot jurisdiction. And people were kind of racing to go there, but we were asking, why do you need to be a DAO, A, and B, what's, who are you, where are you, and what is it that you're actually doing that kind of helps navigate this question. So I think we're definitely seeing another resurgence of DAO, even after we've seen some more litigation from the SEC and CFTC. So it's not as though DAO is going anywhere. I think DAO is getting stronger, or at least the interest in DAO. But I think what DAO looks like is definitely changing over time. People are still emphasizing decentralization, but in terms of tokens, I think the bigger story is more an emphasis on utility. I think what we're seeing as I've helped several companies be guided towards Marshall Islands or other offshore jurisdictions, we're seeing an emphasis on personal liability, limiting that, really addressing shared liability or personal liability in a way that makes them feel safe. And in terms of addressing Reg D or Reg S, having that offshore element makes it a lot easy to navigate in the beginning steps. I think the traditional setup you'll see is the Delaware C Corp with a Cayman Foundation and a BVI entity for your token launch. I think we're going to start seeing more conversations go towards other jurisdictions like Marshall Islands because it's a more palatable price point for entry, and it addresses what these builders need to address in the beginning when their budgets are tight and when they're just looking to kind of build out while being thoughtful, but not overly aggressive on things that they might not need right away. And so I think Marshall Islands is kind of an eloquent solution to solve what a developer and a builder needs in its initial stages. The only thing you'll see that really pushes back is if your VC is really opinionated and wants to see something they've always seen, which is like Cayman, BVI, and Delaware, or even like Wyoming is kind of being thrown in there now, but it's the US, so they're a little bit more comfortable with that. So I think VCs definitely drive a lot of the conversation if they're involved in these early stage decisions. But if it's just a developer and its team or a small team with kind of bootstrapped funding, we're seeing a lot more discussion of enticing jurisdictions like Marshall Islands, or even with Wyoming's DUNA, I've gotten just an influx of emails of people looking to form there or start there. And I think you have to just understand who you are, where you are, and what it is you're looking to do. I was just at ETH Tallinn and Banana Conference in Estonia, and Estonia was an early jurisdiction that was very crypto friendly, and a lot of companies kind of formed there because it was safe to be there, or it was just affordable to be there. But I think I heard a lot more, Marshall Islands come up, and it wasn't just me bringing it up, even internationally. So without the US perspective, I think Marshall Islands is definitely getting a lot more discussion and interest. And I think given how they've been so active on creating thoughtful legislation, you'll see a lot more try to bring that discussion to the table. Obviously, the money defines a lot. So, your banking solutions, your VCs have a lot of opinion. But if it is just a team of builders, we are seeing a lot more discussion about Marshall Islands because it's limited liability, because it's DAO and ethos. There's an ability to be anonymous. There's true decentralization. And I think that's why this will only get stronger in these kinds of conversations. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I will pass now to our last panelist, Pablo Moncada, who is the founder of MoonDAO. MoonDAO is a famous DAO for the crypto space. So he's not a lawyer, but he's definitely someone who is experienced in incorporating a DAO in the Marshall Islands. So I would ask Paolo to share with us first what is MoonDAO, and then his experience with Adam and in incorporating the Marshall Islands. Thank you.
Sure, awesome. Thank you, Paolo. We have the same name, basically, it's just Italian, Spanish.
Yeah, but that's in Italian. You're
right, okay, well, let's see. Yeah, my name is Pablo. I'm an engineer. It's great to see Graham on this call too. Him and I met during Constitution DAO, and shortly after Constitution DAO, I founded a DAO called MoonDAO. So yeah, I guess a little bit about myself. I'm a software engineer. I worked at Google for a few years, and then around COVID time, I kind of had this big feeling that like we need better ways of coordinating, and so especially on a local scale. So I started to work on this project for essentially communities to organize a little bit easier. And then I came across the concept of smart contracts, and I was like, wow, this is incredible. And then I very quickly got I guess pilled on DAO as like, well, this is to me just so obviously the future of coordination, not just for peer-to-peer individuals, but I think it'll eventually extend to every nonprofit, every government on earth. And I think that we're kind of in the early stages of that process, but I really truly believe that it's we're just at the tip of the iceberg in terms of this. So Yeah, I'm a big believer in DAOs. I kind of had this crazy idea of trying to send someone to space using a DAO, and so that became MoonDAO. We initially started with a goal to raise like $500,000, which was what we thought was about the price of a Virgin Galactic ticket. And then in 30 days, we ended up raising 2,600 ETH, and so that was a big surprise. And yeah, we weren't expecting it. And then actually, shortly after that, we got on the phone with Blue Origin, another really big surprise, and then we were able to buy 2 seats on a rocket with Blue Origin. And we sent someone to space using a DAO vote. So we voted as an organization to send the first DAO voted person to space. And then with the other seat, we did a selection process between all of the members, or everyone that wanted to participate in that. So I think you can maybe imagine the sort of legal nightmare that we were for lawyers. And so we want to take, there's 2,200 people that contributed to the organization from all over the world anonymously. And now we wanted to basically do a random selection. And so this almost looks like a lottery. We ended up structuring it as a sweepstakes and making it compliant with US law. We felt it was really important to do it in a way where anyone could enter for free. And yeah, so we ended up talking to basically, I want to say we spent, and you know, I'm done spending so much money on lawyers, so I'm sorry, guys, but we spent tens of thousands of dollars on talking to all kinds of lawyers from all kinds of jurisdictions. We talked to David Kerr and Miles Jennings about all kinds of ways that we could do, you know, Wyoming DAOs or UNAs. We talked to Swiss lawyers. We talked to, we considered Cayman, BVI. Finally, we got connected with MIDAO, and we kind of just tried to, and it's such a tough thing because you're basically asking a founder to become a lawyer, and to some extent, because you're having to make this incredibly high-dimensional decision. There's so many aspects to this decision, and I'd say there's probably less than, maybe you guys know the figure better, but I'd say, from my experience, less than 100 people on planet Earth that are competent when it comes to understanding DAOs. Maybe some people, yeah, they don't really get it. And so that was a lot of what we were running into. And also, I mean, there's securities laws. There's and on top of that, we try to get all of our members to come together and form a constitution. So we actually started from there. So we said, okay, forget all this legal stuff. How do we want to govern ourselves? And we hosted, you know, 4 or 5 hour long Discord calls for months. And I'm not even kidding, where we would discuss every single point of our constitution, how we want it to be organized. And so you can imagine it's just this mess until Adam came along, and actually it was one of our members in our DAO. His name is Fabian Valencia, and he was really kind of very helpful in helping us navigate a lot of these things. And yeah, ultimately we looked at the nonprofit law in the Marshall Islands, and we're like, wow, this is such a blessing. Really, it felt like just like this immense blessing that we had found. We'd found a jurisdiction that really fit us, and so now I guess I've become the poster boy for MIDAO, but I'm a happy poster boy, I guess. So far, so good. It's been very easy and straightforward, honestly. And so, yeah. Now we're currently in the process of opening a bank account, and so that's also been kind of a question that we've been working on for a while. But Adam's been able to introduce us to, I think, 5 different banks. that are all working with Marshall Islands. And so I guess that's kind of, in my opinion, the last piece of the puzzle in terms of being able to bridge with the quote unquote traditional legal world. Once you, I mean, ideally we self-custody everything, but sometimes we found that it's very necessary to have this sort of tool so you can bridge fiat to crypto. So we'd like to have you know, the ability to control our own bank account as well as a DAO. And we're also trying to figure out the right ways to do that as a DAO. And yeah, it's been quite a journey, but it's I feel like I've learned so much about a bunch of different jurisdictions, probably more than I care to have learned. But you know, ultimately, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm the least qualified person here to really give anyone legal advice about the Marshall Islands. But you know, I guess I can speak to the process and what it looked like for us and our DAO. And yeah, that's all I really have to say.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I don't think there are questions, not simply there are no questions, correct?
We do have some questions.
Okay, so please.
For anybody who wants to put their questions into the Q&A module, please feel free. We're going to just kind of cycle through these. It looks like, Yonks, you've got a few different questions, and so let me, I'm going to have to change the settings. Yeah, the first question that he had was thoughts and concerns about U.S. legal nexus. Actually, give me a moment. I'll pull everybody off of mute and see if we can just let them flag their questions for the panel. All right. So Yonks, you should be able to turn on your microphone.
Yeah, I got it. Thanks, Simply.
Great.
So this was going back to the common entity choices matrix there. And one of the things that was put forward by Adam from MIDAO.org was this idea about the RMI DAO minimizing your US legal nexus. And here in the USA, we've got the Gary problem with the SEC. And if a DAO protocol has a good portion of existing token holders based in the USA, does it really matter where the DAO is legally formed?
Whoever wants to answer, Adam, maybe.
Well, I'll share what I hear most commonly, but I'm really curious if Elsie or Tatyana would like to weigh in as well. But what I hear people saying is, first of all, it's a good question because, yeah, the more that your DAO is in the United States, right? And there's a lot of different ways to look at that, whether it's the token holders, the founders, the contributors and members, the users, et cetera, right? The less likely it is that you'll be effective using an offshore non-US legal entity for possibly multiple reasons. The one I actually hear most often is tax, that the IRS has sometimes sued Americans who use a foreign entity for something that's really just taking place in the United States, and therefore they never should have used that entity in the first place, is the IRS's argument. And so they'll say that they're going to disregard the entity for tax purposes and treat it as a pass-through entity. And so, you know, what I don't have as good a sense of is like, where do you draw the line, right? Like what percentage of your DAO can be in the United States today or in the long run, such that you can consider entities all over the world versus when you really should look internally? And when should you have multiple entities? Like, I think I read a statistic that 75% of US-based VC firms have a Cayman entity in addition to a US entity, such that their foreign investors invest in the Cayman entity and their US investors invest in the Delaware or their US entity. Maybe that's where DAOs will end up in the long run too. But yeah, would either of the lawyers like to comment on this as well?
Yeah, please. Someone else.
Yeah, I can weigh in a little bit. So Adam's kind of right on the money that it depends on the activity and the agency that's interested. So the IRS generally has a way to get theirs. You know, if that's who they're going after. If you're using it as a way to avoid something, the IRS tends to find a way to get theirs. In terms of the other, three-letter agencies that we all love to hate, there's aspects of compliance that you can do offshore a little bit easier. This is why you see a Delaware C Corp, a Cayman, foundation, and a BVI token launch. There's ways to kind of parse up different activities to ensure compliance at different layers or different levels along the way. So if you can use that entity to comply with Reg S and keep that raise offshore and away from the US in that early stage, like that's an easier kind of lift than complying with necessarily like Reg D along the whole way, right? If you have the point of that offshore entity is to kind of facilitate an arm's length. When it's problematic is when it's every single member is a US token holder and they're already holding that token. You still are required as those members to comply. Just because you're part of an offshore entity, it's the offshore entity's activities that may be separate, but you as an individual US person still have certain obligations to different US agencies. So it really depends on like what lens you're looking at it through. Are you looking at it through the lens of the individual token holder or the DAO as a whole? And what level of comfort they have in the Cayman or in the offshore element. The threshold's usually, I think it's 50%. So if you can keep less than 50% as US persons, that tends to be the threshold. If I'm not mistaken, it's 50%. So what you see with Cayman is like the board members, you see less than 50% of the board members be US people, and then you're kind of still in that comfort level. But it really depends on your activities. It depends on your total number of members, what you're doing, and in the individual members' assessments. So just moving something offshore doesn't negate anything. It kind of gives you a different list of things to comply with for whatever activity you're doing.
I don't know, Tatyana, someone else. Okay, I wanted just to add a comment from my side, and I'm no US lawyer, so I don't know really. I'm not able to speak about the US. But I would say that this is generally an international principle that, of course, if you have a group of people based in a country that just to do an economic activity and they create an offshore company in some other countries, that tax agency of the country where those people live, they could say, okay, you are just avoiding paying taxes. That's really generally. But in crypto space, this is more or less a little bit unlikely, at least based on my experience, because generally will have people like, I don't know, maybe coming from Italy, like myself, like from Argentina, like Pablo that spoke before, someone from the US, someone from, I don't know, Brazil, so they're really very international. So if the US part of the project is only a piece of a very international, diverse team of people, in those cases, which are, in my experience, really the majority, if not all cases, it really makes sense to incorporate in Marshall Island or in some other offshore jurisdiction. So if there are no other comments about this, I don't know, simply the other questions, please.
So the next one, Yonks, you had that I think is relevant in here. It looks like you were sort of addressing a comparison between the Duna and the Marshall Islands entity as far as a no board structure. Do you want to bring that question forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And this again goes back to the common entity choices matrix that Adam presented on here. And during the previous LexDAO Duna study group, one of the questions that I asked there, and this is coming from the perspective of not only a DAO founder, but also of a participant in DAO. A lot of us that are operating within the US are very familiar with the CTA that FinCEN put forward, the Corporate Transparency Act. And I specifically asked about that because that's really the thing that provides for anonymous or pseudo-anonymous contributions to the DAO. And I asked that question, and Miles Jennings very specifically said that it was the Duna Act was by design where you don't have to comply with the Corporate Transparency Act and allows for anonymous or pseudo-anonymous membership within the DAO. So that was the first thing. And then also the way that I understand the DUNA is that you actually cannot have a board as far as a trustees, directors, whatever that looks like, but you can have an operational administrator, not necessarily somebody that makes executive decisions as a board normally would. So that's more just some reflections, at least my understanding after participating and going through the DUNA regulation or the DUNA Act. And I'm not an attorney, but I really loved the thing that Pablo put forward as far as like, as a DAO founder, I've had to learn way more about this stuff than I would really care to, because it's been challenging. Because, you know, as somebody that's got some assets that I want to protect personally, I also want to have organizational and members protection, where the DAOs that we create, the participants and the members in that aren't held personally responsible. So I don't know if anybody wanted to reflect upon that. And this is, again, you nailed that simply, as far as really looking. And this is also one of the things, just to put things in frame of reference, simply is also participating with myself in Unlock Protocol. And this is something that we're trying to make a decision of as a protocol DAO, what makes the most sense. And we've really shortlisted right now. And I really loved, Adam, where you said that as far as your understanding, that really the only legal regulations that have been passed are the Marshall Islands and then several U.S. states, and Wyoming's kind of leading the charge with their DAO LLC and now the DUNA Act. But anyway, I would love to hear some thoughts on those 2 points there.
Yeah, please. Anyone?
Well, based on the research I was doing over the last few minutes into the DUNA, yeah, it looks like they have something called administrators, which manage the organization but are not called managers. And I think that's actually a really nice kind of middle ground where, you know, maybe we need something that's not exactly the same as how we've always had managers in organizations, but it sounds like there's still something maybe somewhat similar. And the only thing I'll say about the CTA is that there's a difference between whether the organization has to know the identities of the members and whether that information is shared with the government. And so, for example, it's possible that the DUNA would still have to know the names and addresses of its members, maybe just the administrators, maybe all the members, I don't know. But that because they don't have to do the CTA, they don't have to tell it to the government. So that's the other nuance. I'd probably reach out to Miles and try to get more details on that, or hopefully I'll just read the law myself pretty soon. And the other thing in terms of the members, I guess the nuance there is every token holder a member of the DUNA? So you have two classes of members effectively, administrators and other members. In which case I would say, yes, there are anonymous members. Or is it that the token holders are not actually members of the company? The only real members of the company are the administrators. And therefore you could argue that everyone else is still anonymous, but perhaps not members in the first place.
Okay. So any other questions simply?
Oh, well, I'll just add to that.
Oh, yeah, sorry, please, Laura, please.
Yeah, so I think we're seeing like a surgence of what is DAO. I think we're so early on DAO, and the first iteration was just DAO as an alternative to corporations, which was like worthless ultimately, because they just became Cayman foundations with a board and an offshore corporation, basically, with DAO in its name and maybe some on-chain activity. But I think as Web3 evolves and as DAOs evolve, what we're answering is, you know, how can communities form? How can people form a group to be productive, to answer questions, to work together in a way that's quasi formal or quasi organized on chain, or however they've structured it, while safely being covered under terms of liability or covered under anonymity. And as DAO evolves, I think we'll start to tackle some of these nuances, and you'll get more answers through different legislations. I mean, MIDAO does a great job of working so closely with the Marshall Islands government to make sure that as they get more clients coming in and forming, they're being so responsive to be like, well, we need to define this, we need to answer this, we need to clarify this, because DAO is evolving. And so I think whatever jurisdiction is the quickest to evolve to whatever DAO exists and how DAO wants to push innovation will be the winner ultimately in this space, because they'll be solving for a new type of organizing people. And that's really what DAO is going after. It's not just a business, it's not a company. It's a new type of organizing people in a way that rewards contribution and all these other things. And we'll see ultimately who wins the race. But right now, we've got some interesting jurisdictions, we've got some great options, and people are pushing this forward.
I would like to add that Laura, I totally agree with her. DAO is about communities, about decentralization. So it's really giving the possibility to communities to establish themselves and through smart contracts, basically, because we are all in crypto. So that's really the ethos of crypto. So if there is no one else about this, I think we can pass to some other questions.
I have just a small thing. Yeah. I think it's interesting, the sort of like differentiation between administrators or managers or something of the DAO. I mean, I think that there's kind of like maybe there's a camp of people that think that, you know, as tools evolve, as things get better, maybe we can get rid of this idea of like administrators altogether. I'm not so sure. At least today, I don't think it's really possible. And I'm very curious, you know, how other DAOs kind of solve for this sort of dilemma of like high coherence or high context individuals and their relationship with kind of like the broader membership group. And the way that MoonDAO has tried to resolve this as a problem is essentially like every single transaction that comes out of our DAO treasury requires a vote of the entire membership. And we've actually created 3 branches of governance. And maybe this sounds like overkill to some people, but it was the only way that we could really resolve it, where we have a security council, essentially, basically like members of a multi-sig that can be voted in or out, and essentially serve to make sure that whatever the DAO wants to happen happens. But if there is an attack on our governance, that they can recognize that and protect against that. And then we also have another kind of council, which is just people that are high context, high coherence, and we define them based off of the work that they're doing. They actually require a DAO vote to basically outline the objectives of the work that they're doing, and they receive funding for that work. And then we appoint one member of each of those working groups to basically a council. And that anatomy of our DAO might be unorthodox. I'm actually, you know, I don't spend a ton of time in other DAOs. I do try to read and try to get an idea of how other DAOs are structured. But yeah, it'll be curious to see how the law, you know, ends up catching up to maybe like a consensus anatomy. But I don't know if we'll ever even reach that, or as the tools will kind of cause the structure to keep evolving and evolving. So yeah, I mean, I think what the Marshall Islands does really well is that it keeps things very open-ended, so that it can allow for that sort of evolution. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, and our last question goes back to the dialogue around the costs associated with setting up some of these organizations, and how this looks different as part of the Marshall Islands. So Yanks, if you want to frame that for the speakers.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank everybody, the panelists, and thanks LexDAO for putting this together. I feel like I've hogged the question and answers portion here, but especially for startup organizations, or still categorically bootstrapping organizations, formation costs and ongoing OpEx costs are always a concern. So I think that this would be a great opportunity for Adam, and I want to thank Adam for simplifying the formation. And I've heard good things about MIDAO.org, and I think Pablo being on here is just further evidence of the good things that you're doing. So kudos, Adam, for what you're doing there at MIDAO.org. So the question that I've got are, what are the startup costs to establish a DAO using MIDAO.org? And then what are the ongoing annual OPEX costs to maintain a DAO with MIDAO.org and RMI?
There was Adam, if that's fine for you, Laura also raised her hand. So I would, no, you don't, you didn't? Okay, I'm sorry. So Adam, please answer to.
Yeah, so the short version is that our pricing is actually listed on our website. So if you go to MIDAO.org/pricing, and I'll just throw it in the chat as well. And we have what we call needs-based pricing. So it depends on the size of the DAO's treasury or the project's funding. It can actually be as low as $3,000, as high as $9,500, just depending on, again, how big your treasury is. And then the smallest package also just includes a little bit less hand-holding through the process, so you could always do the middle package. Just so everyone knows, we do offer meaningfully discounted prices to lawyers. And so for LexDAO members, for other lawyers, you can get a discounted price for your client because it's easier for us if our client has a lawyer. And that way, the lawyer is also going to still have to bill them for time, helping them with stuff that maybe we would have helped them with otherwise, and probably do a better job and help them with even more stuff. And so it may end up being a similar price or a little bit higher, but now you're working with a lawyer who's helping you through the process instead of just us helping you through the process.
Okay, thank you. I think this was last question, no? Correct?
Yes.
So if there are no other questions, I don't know if we, Adam, no, someone, Martin.
Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if my audio is okay, but I just wanted to know the fiat links, like how are the practicalities of the DAO transacting off chain? How do people solve that problem? You know, and what are the solutions? Is it just it doesn't really happen because the off-chain activity is handled by other corporations in the structure that, like Adam talked about at the beginning, or are there any examples out there just to get a feel for it?
Well,
Adam,
if you're talking about things like bank accounts, like we have clients who have, and when I say clients, those are the DAO LLCs, right? They have bank accounts, they have exchange accounts, they enter into contracts with other organizations. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, that's the nice thing about this legal entity, is it does kind of bridge you from the blockchain world to the traditional world and allow you to operate in the traditional world. We have clients who make equity investments in companies and enter into other kinds of interesting agreements by real estate. So pretty much anything any other legal form company can do, the DAO LLC can also do. Now, it can be harder to get a bank account as a Marshall Islands entity compared to a Delaware company, especially in the United States, for example. And it's not always as easy because it's a novel form. And a lot also depends on how do you structure your DAO LLC, right? We have some DAO LLCs that look just like a normal LLC. If you read their operating agreement, which is the governing document, just like it is for a regular LLC, it might just say there are 3 members who are listed on Exhibit A, and 2 of them are the managers. And now when you apply for a bank account or something else, that other organization just says, oh, I'm basically dealing with an LLC. In fact, they might not even notice that it's anything different at all. Whereas in other cases, the operating agreement will say the members are tracked through a token living on this blockchain at this address, and everyone who holds a token is a member, and every token gives them 1 vote. And maybe it'll say we're algorithmically managed, not member managed. And now whoever you're doing business with, if they look at the operating agreements, might be a little more concerned, and it might be a little bit harder to do business with them.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess that was kind of exactly an example of the question. It was just having been a small founder, getting a bank account is like weeks or months, depending on the complexities, and shopping around. So I think it is kind of a practical question, especially the costs of that tend to be almost as high as potentially is getting the legal advice in the first place. So I was just wondering what examples we have. I mean, a DAO LLC that's just an LLC. So are you talking about, is that a Marshall Islands one, or what,
Yeah,
what was your
yeah.
example?
Yeah, so like for example,
Okay.
just to go into a little more detail, so like the DAO LLC is kind of like the Duna is in UNA, but you're opting into the new law. And again, I was just kind of reading it a little bit earlier. And it's similar with the Wyoming DAO LLC. It is an LLC, but you're opting into being a DAO LLC, which means you're subject to the terms of the new DAO, the DAO Act in Wyoming. Same thing in the Marshall Islands. So what that means also, and if you look at the language of the new law, it reduces some restrictions and enables new possibilities. But if you want to, you can structure your DAO LLC exactly like a traditional LLC in the Marshall Islands, and I think elsewhere too. And so yeah, that's what I was saying, is that you're not required to use smart contracts or tokens or the blockchain. You're not required to not have managers, right? You can have managers. You're not required to allow for anonymous members. You can make everyone give their name and address to be a member. So you can do everything in a totally kind of like familiar way if you want to. And something some of our clients have done, and I don't think necessarily to try to get around compliance procedures, but it's just the reality of the scenario. They found the DAO. It looks like a normal LLC, except that it has DAO in the name, which opts you into the new law. And there's one line you put in your operating agreement that opts you into the new law, but it looks otherwise like a regular LLC. They get a bank account at Western Alliance, or we had one at Signature Bank. And then maybe 6 months down the road, now they amend their operating agreement. And now there's a token that's tracking membership. Now there's no more managing members. And honestly, I don't know when, if ever, is that bank going to ask for an updated copy of the operating agreement. Probably depends on the bank. And so you have a DAO that's kind of started out in a more traditional form, done their KYB with other organizations, and now they're making things a little more complicated. And so some have had success doing things that way.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I guess, thank you. That answers the question. I guess, just motivated by the example of Constitution DAO, like in a week doing things. The path to doing that with a Marshall Islands DAO is still a little bit unclear to me. But I get it, what you're saying. I mean, it's a very complicated answer. It's facts, circumstances dependent. So appreciate it.
Yeah, and look, let's maybe we could dig into that in a little more detail, because I think it's a really interesting point. If you were doing Constitution DAO today and you were doing it with lawyers involved to try to reduce the risk, and you were incorporating it in the Marshall Islands or anywhere, you could no longer do that in 1 week, right? You are trading off some of the kind of benefits of DAO technology, which is that you can move so fast if you want to, with some risk management by trying to be a little more conscious of the legal environment you're operating in and manage various risks. And so now it's not going to be as cheap and it's not going to be as fast, but that's probably, I mean, in most cases, that's probably better. I think that's what most founders these days would do, is they'd say, hey, I'm not just going to do everything on the blockchain and assume that means everything's going to be fine. I'm going to hire a lawyer. I'm going to maybe register in a jurisdiction somewhere. That might slow things down a bit, but still you're automating meaningful parts of the organization, right? I mean, just the idea of, like, let's say in one case you say, that in a traditional LLC, to add members to the company, you need to sign these like amendments and membership interest purchase agreements with for every time you want to add a member. And so now maybe every day for a week, you're doing these like documents that need hundreds or thousands of signatures, versus if you track your membership on a blockchain and you say that simply by acquiring the tokenized membership interest, which is this ERC20 contract on this blockchain, you become a member. Well, now you've obviated the need for creating those documents, distributing them, collecting the signatures, validating that it's all done correctly. And so now you can grow from 0 to 100,000 members in 5 minutes if you want to, even in a totally legally compliant way. Now, again, the lawyer might say, well, would you like to know who your members are before you let them join? Should there be some KYC process? Should there be some kind of restriction? Do you want to try to make sure you don't have people joining from sanctioned countries? And then again, so there's kind of this push and pull of like, okay, well, you can just automate everything, but should you? And what's the right balance? Or do any other panelists like to weigh in on that? I think it's an interesting one.
Well, I want to add one point of information with Constitution DAO, which is that Sotheby's actually required like fiat in a bank account in order to place a bid. They wouldn't just accept that, okay, we have this Ethereum here. And it was actually FTX that was able to say, okay, we'll help you guys off ramp and do that. So if Constitution DAO needed to create its own bank account, it wouldn't have been able to do that in a week. Yeah.
Thanks.
And I think Graham's in the call, so you could probably add more context too. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the other kind of eccentricities to it was we did have to actually have a KYC'd entity, which is weird when you've got lots and lots of donors. I mean, the whole thing was actually technically set up as a U.S. nonprofit, and we were very explicit with individuals as they participated that what you're participating in is a donation, and what you're receiving will be a governance token. And since ultimately we didn't have something to govern, we ended up winding down the organization. But there was probably gray space involved in what we did, and I think it'd be very difficult to try to do exactly the same way again today, just given the level of kind of scrutiny that happens to exist.
So I don't know if there are other questions, other comments. Maybe Adam, you want to give a final, say something final, let's say about Marshall Island?
Sure, thanks. I mean, I would just say that, again, we're a registered agent and we try to provide some helpful business services on top of that. But our network of lawyers and other partners is a huge part of what makes MIDAO possible. And so two things. One is if anyone who's listening to this is a DAO member, but not a lawyer, or you're a lawyer, but you're new to DAOs or you're new to Web3, we can get you connected with expert DAO and Web3 lawyers, Marshall Islands lawyers, the folks who are on this call, as well as others. There's this massive network. I mean, Paolo's in the network, right? A lot of folks I see here are in the network. And if you're a lawyer listening to this who's not yet in our network, please reach out about there's no cost or anything. It's just an informal, join the Telegram group, let's have a conversation. And that way, both we can help make sure that everything you need to know about the Marshall Islands, your discounted pricing, stuff like that. But also that way, when we have a prospect or a client that's looking for legal advice, same goes for tax advice and other things, and if you're the right fit for them, we'll be able to introduce them to you. And so you may be able to find additional business by becoming part of this new MIDAO network of lawyers and other service providers. So I guess those will be my final words. And the same thing goes for future legislation and regulation. So we're at least once a year, we're going to work on a new act or amendment. And I think eventually, if you look at the shipping registry, there's a new law probably 3 or 4 times a year, because you just always want to stay ahead and current with global legal and regulatory issues and environments. Same thing is true for us as we get up to speed. Maybe it's once a year, but pretty soon we'll be going to our partners Telegram group and sending out an email to all the lawyers I know saying, hey, we're going to start working on the new amendment or law for 2024. Would love your input. And that's your chance to say, well, geez, in my practice, here's the challenge I run into most frequently. If there was some way for the Marshall Islands to adopt a law or a clause or regulation that does X, Y, Z, that'd be really helpful to me and my clients. We can try to do that with your help. So would love just to have people reach out, whether it's on LinkedIn, email, Farcaster, Twitter, wherever, so we can stay in touch with you about those things.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And so thank you from LexDAO. And this will be recorded. It will be on our LexDAO YouTube channel. So everyone will be able to see again. Watch again. So thank you very much and have a nice day. Bye everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye all.
Bye.
Bye.